Well, hello everybody. It's Pumpkin. Today's the day. It's time for our new series of the book, But I Know I Love You. Yeah, we're so excited about this. So here we go. Episode 1. I hope you enjoy it. I'm sure it's going to be great. It's going to be great. And thank you so much to Steve and Camre for allowing us to do this. We appreciate it.
Dedication to Camre, who is the strongest, bravest person I've ever known, Steve. To Steve, who has never left my side, Camre. To Gavin, our wonderful son, Mommy and Daddy love you. To all nurses in neonatal intensive care units who are simply the best. To all caregivers who have to shoulder so much responsibility every day. We'd like to thank God for wrapping His arms around our family and protecting us. Camre's parents, John and Cheryl Carr, for being there when we needed them the most. Steve's mom, Julie Sullivan, for always lending an ear, and Steve's dad, Dwayne Curto, for his support. Jessica Smith, Camre's occupational therapist from Galaxy Brain and Therapy Center, for all she has done to help Camre get her life back. And the University of Michigan Medical School doctors and nurses for getting us answers. Preface. The first thing I noticed was that unmistakable hospital smell. I think I've gotten used to over the years, but maybe you never really get used to that mixture of antiseptic, medication, and fear. At least, not once it's been a part of your life. That day, though, the smell was still relatively new, foreign, and a little unnerving. I nodded at the woman behind the front desk, crossed the lobby, and headed toward the elevator. The door opened, and I stepped inside. I drew a sharp breath as the door glided shut in front of me. I was grateful that I was the only one in the elevator. I didn't want to make small talk about the weather. I didn't want to have to explain why I was here. I didn't want to listen to someone else tell me why they were here. I knew I had to be ready mentally for whatever lay ahead. There was no energy to spare on strangers. I pushed the elevator button, a slight whir, a jerk. The door opened onto the 4th floor. An alarm beeping somewhere in the distance broke the otherwise heavy stillness. I walked past the med station where nurses and doctors consulted charts and talked in hushed tones. I continued down the hallway and stopped in front of Camre's room. I shut my eyes for a second, then straightened my shoulders and put my game face on. The room was windowless and still, except for the slight swoosh of a blood pressure pump and the flicker of a monitor. I stood at the end of the bed. Camre looked fragile under the glare of the overhead light. An IV was connected to one arm and a blood pressure cuff was on the other. Her too pale face was rounder than usual from all the medications she'd been given, and her eyes were shut. She was asleep, but her breathing was so slow and shallow that I had to look carefully to make sure she was still alive. I glanced at her mother, who was sitting in a chair by her side, and then came closer and leaned over the rails of the bed. "Hey, honey, I'm here," I said softly as I touched her hand. She opened her eyes and looked up. I knew she saw me, but the emptiness in her eyes told me she had no idea who I was. She didn't know that I was her fiancé. She didn't know that we had a child. I'm not sure she was even aware she was in a hospital. She looked around the room, and a flicker of fear appeared, only to be replaced by a blank and empty gaze. "I'm here," I said again. She glanced at me, closed her eyes, and I turned to her mom. Her mom shook her head, and I got the answer I had dreaded. There was no change in Camre's condition. She was still heavily sedated, barely responsive to anything or anyone. Her mom had been spending as much time as she could with Camre during the day, since I was still working full-time and couldn't be there as much as I would have liked. I wanted someone with Camre when the doctors came in, someone who could ask the questions that didn't seem to have any answers, someone Camre knew just in case she suddenly woke up. I couldn't bear the thought of her being alone, but I didn't have any more sick leave or vacation time, so I needed to work. I would visit in the mornings and again in the evenings, trying to juggle the responsibilities that felt like they were crushing me. I tried not to let my sadness show on my face. I knew that Camre's mom was having a hard time seeing her daughter so close to death. Even though her grandson Gavin John was in a neonatal unit in another nearby hospital, this was her baby lying in the hospital bed. "Anyone come in?" "Only the nurses," she said. "They told me that a neurosurgeon would be coming by soon." We both knew that soon could mean any time in the next 24 hours. In days since Camre had been transferred to intensive care at the University of Michigan Medical School, we had learned that doctors make their rounds at odd and unpredictable times. It sometimes seemed they had a radar that told them the minute we left the room and decided to make an appearance just then. I turned back to Camre and brushed a strand of dark brown hair from her forehead. "How are you doing?" I asked. I wanted to sound as normal and as calm as I could, even though I didn't expect a response. She blinked her eyes open, and for a moment I thought I saw a spark of the old Camre, but it faded as quickly as it had come. I decided that I must have imagined it as I stared into her eyes, void, empty of any recognition, any personality. I kissed her on the cheek. She turned her face away, and I felt a sick feeling wash over me. Camre, the love of my life, the mother of my son, was somewhere beyond my reach. The evening was heavy with the odd timelessness that characterizes most hospitals. Nurses and aide dropped in, checked IVs, took vitals, and sometimes asked if Camre's mom and I wanted something to drink. Occasionally we took them up on their offer. The rest of the time we sat watching the TV with the sound muted so that we didn't disturb Camre, or playing on our phones, or just watching Camre for some sign of change. An hour or so passed, and her mom suggested that I go see Gavin, but I wanted to wait on the chance that the neurosurgeon came by before night. "You can go," I said. "No, I'll wait with you." Just then the hospital door opened, and the neurosurgeon who had been called in as the specialist on Camre's case entered. She greeted us with a half smile and a brief introduction before reading the notes in Camre's chart and listening to Camre's breathing with her stethoscope. Camre stared into the distance, unresponsive. The doctor made a few notes and then turned to face Camre's mom and me. Her face was impassive and professional. "I'm sorry," she began. I felt my stomach drop and my knees get wobbly. It is never a good sign when a doctor begins with an apology. I reached out for Camre's hand and squeezed it tight. I hoped she might squeeze it back, but she didn't. We had been waiting for days for precise answers to what had happened during Gavin's birth, and now the time for answers had arrived. I was afraid of what the doctor would say, but more afraid not to know. The neurosurgeon's voice was soft and low as she explained that Camre had suffered a severe brain injury while giving birth to her son. I nodded. We had been told that much before. Just looking at her, you could tell that something had happened to her brain. The doctor added that her memory was affected. Again, I nodded. Then the doctor began to talk about brain bleed and short-term and long-term memory loss, using a slew of medical terms. The words started to blur into an almost meaningless jumble. If you ask me what a DW1625 car window is, I'll know what you're talking about, but medial temporal lobes, hippocampus, neocortex, and intracerebral hemorrhage were just words that clearly didn't convey good news. I don't understand, I said. Instinctively, I squeezed Camre's hand again. Again, it lay limply in my palm. What are you talking about? I asked. The neurosurgeon paused. In the years that have passed since that horrendous day, I now realize that medical professionals find it easier to use formal medical terms when they have to deliver bad news. It's easier on them. It lets them stay more detached. It protects them from the pain that is a necessary part of their job. What does this all mean? I asked again. The neurosurgeon glanced down, then looked directly at me. There's no easy way to say this. The words tumbled out. Camre has total and permanent memory loss, both long-term and short-term. She can't remember anything that happened to her in the past, and she can't remember anything that happens to her now. She has no memory at all of anything. I heard her mother sob, and I felt a sudden tightness in my chest. Are you sure she can't remember anything? Her mother asked with a quavering voice. She will never be able to remember anything? Not her family? Not Steve? Not her baby? The doctor shook her head. As far as we can tell, she has no memory beyond the present moment. The brain injury has wiped out all of Camre's memories, as well as her ability to make new memories. She has no clue who she is or who any of you are, and maybe never will. At that moment, I understood the emptiness I had seen in Camre's eyes the weeks, the lack of emotion, the inability to recognize me. I was a stranger, a perpetual stranger. I'm sure I must have looked as devastated as I felt. The doctor sucked in a quick breath and resumed her professional stance. However, this is a very unusual case, she said. Very unusual. Neither I nor any of my colleagues have ever encountered anything quite like this before, so we don't know for sure what her ultimate prognosis will be. Normally, when someone suffers the kind of sustained loss of oxygen Camre did, they're in a vegetative state, or worse. Camre isn't in that state. Will she ever be normal again? I allowed myself a tiny bit of hope. The doctor paused. It depends on what you mean by normal. I could tell she was wanting to leave me with something positive. We know that several areas of her brain haven't been affected by this. What does that mean? Her brain is like a computer hard drive that has had all the files erased. The computer can still function, but nothing that was stored on the hard drive can ever be recovered. We think that with therapy, Camre will be able to do some things like feed herself and get dressed. It will be sort of like reinstalling programs in a computer. She may be able to reload programs for walking and talking, but none of the documents or photos, her memories, can ever be restored. I tried to absorb what the doctor was saying. She went on. Once she recovers from the physical effects of having blood in her brain, and that can happen pretty quickly, she should be able to do many things. She won't have to be in a wheelchair or live in an institution. She will be able to go home, but she will never be able to live on her own. Her voice resumed a professional edge. For instance, she might be able to feed herself, she said, but she won't know how to prepare a meal, and she probably won't remember that she has eaten after she has had a meal. But don't give up hope, she added. The brain is remarkable. We are just now learning about its ability to heal itself. Heal itself? Yes, we used to think that once the cells of the brain were destroyed, they could never recover. But now we know that it is not necessarily true. She shifted back into professional mode as she went on to talk about neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the brain to change and reorganize itself. She explained that while a brain can't regrow missing parts any more than a foot can regrow a missing toe, it can make remarkable adjustments. We are just now learning that the functions of a brain that are associated with a certain location in the brain can transfer over time to a different location, she said. The brain can compensate for damage by making new connections within itself. In other words, even a permanently damaged brain can continue to change and perhaps learn. But she won't get her memory back? None of her memories? I had to ask again to make sure. No. The word was final. What we don't know is if she will ever be able to form and hold new memories as her brain heals. Right now, she isn't able to remember anything. It's hard to explain, she added. But Camre is in a perpetual present moment. All she knows is what is happening right this second, and the next second, and the next. I don't want to give you false hope, she continued, but we just can't say for sure what is going to happen with Camre. She is a 1 in a million case. I asked the question that had been haunting me since that terrible day. Will she be able to be a mom? Will she be able to do mom things like read to Gavin and see him go to school? The thought that Camre would never know she was a mom, that she never could be the mom she had wanted to be, was almost unbearable. The neurosurgeon smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen. The important thing to remember is that her capacity to love hasn't been lost. We love with the heart, not the mind. Camre might not remember having had a baby, but she can love him, and you. All of a sudden, a new thought made me feel frantic. What about our baby? I asked. What about our son? Since Gavin John Curto was born a month early by C-section, he had been in a neonatal intensive care unit. I had assumed he was there because he was so premature. Now I was worried that whatever had happened to Camre had somehow harmed him. As far as I know, Gavin is fine, the doctor said. According to the reports I've read, he's a perfectly normal baby. You'll have to consult with the neonatal specialists, but I'm guessing he will stay in the hospital for a couple more weeks since he was so tiny when he was born. But there's no reason to think that he won't grow up to be a healthy child. She started to leave and then turned back. You and Camre have a long road ahead of you. You'll be spending a lot of time in doctors' offices, she said. But you also have a beautiful new baby boy. After the doctor left the room, I let go of Camre's hand. She seemed to be sleeping, but it was hard to tell because she was so unresponsive. I'll be back in a little while, I told her mother. I'm going to go see Gavin. As I drove across town to the hospital where my son was, everything I had just heard from the neurosurgeon rattled in my head. At first, no one had seemed to know exactly what had happened, but now that we had the results of the medical findings, the answers morphed into more questions. We like to think that doctors have all the answers, but they don't, especially not in cases like this. All anyone could tell me were the medical details of the event. They couldn't tell me what was going to happen because they didn't know. No one knew. I pulled into the hospital parking lot and took a deep breath. Camre might be in her own world, but there was a new life waiting for me here. At the entrance to the neonate unit, I scrubbed up as usual and walked over to Gavin's incubator. He looked so tiny lying there with an oxygen tube in his nose, an IV in his arm, and a heart monitors on his chest. But his little fingers and toes were perfect, and I saw his mother in his face. I have a picture of us from that time. Gavin is sound asleep, his head turned toward the camera. I'm giving a thumbs up, and I have a half smile on my lips. As I look at the picture today, I can see the pride in my eyes and the joy I felt knowing that I was now a father, something I thought about my entire life. But more than that, I see my determination. I leaned over the crib and promised my boy that I would never let him down. I was his dad, and I was here for him for the rest of my life. But more than that, I made a promise to myself. I vowed right then and there that I would stay strong no matter what. We were a family, Camre, Gavin, and me. Absolutely nothing was going to change that. I love you and your mom, I whispered, and I always will.
Oh my goodness. Was that not just beautiful? Don't you just want to hug somebody? For some of us, it might just be our fur baby, because we're not in the mood to be hugging any significant other, plus social distancing. So, yeah, okay. Can't wait to hear more, and we hope you're all doing great. Okay, bye guys.